thank you once again for coming along to Eco Views and News. Today we're going to look at a whole range of things, but especially the popular movements against the use of carbon. In effect, the use of carbon in our energy system is so pervasive that it's hard to figure out how to counter it at this point. But it's very clear that popular movements around the country and around the world are beginning to do so, because there's so much at stake, particularly for the climate. Now, this has shown up in various movements that have had major victories this past week. Last week at this time, 10,000 people were encircling, totally surrounding the White House. This is a huge movement. And its victory was very apparent to those who were involved, but even to those who didn't hear about it before this. It's just the tar sands movement. And with banners like this, climate change is not in our national interest. No tar sands, Keystone XL pipeline. Keystone XL pipeline was the big one that the president was supposed to decide on. So we're going to look at a series of these things, and in particular the whole question of the grassroots movements behind them. Tar sands, mountaintop removal is another big one, and that's what's going on in large parts of Appalachia, where they blow away the top of mountains to get at the coal underneath it. And the third popular uprising of the grassroots struggles is this fracking in the Marcellus Shale. This is the fracking that's been referred to again and again, and you'll see it come back as the grassroots struggle to keep carbon in the ground. There's been a lot of talk about carbon sequestration, about how you can take CO2 and pump it down into the ground again. Well, it'd be a lot simpler to keep it there in the first place and not to let it out, as it were. Well, at the same time, just during this last week, there's been a big movement to whip up support on the part of various astroturf movements, as they're being called. This happened last November 4th and 5th, which was last Friday, a week ago Friday and Saturday. A group called Americans for Prosperity had a big rally in their indoor symposium in Washington called Defending the American Dream. What they meant by defending was basically defending a notion of Ronald Reagan deregulation, get the government to not regulate these things. So this struggle is going on at the same time. It's presenting itself as a grassroots movement, but this kind of defending the American dream is a very different approach in the astroturf tradition than this approach, rebuilding the dream. Called the American Dream movement of a grassroots citizen movement. So it's really quite interesting to see these things play out in 1 week. We've had on an international scale, the resignation of the head of Greece, the head of the prime minister in Italy, all responding to the kinds of crises that have been brought on by the banks. And here in America, we've had an extraordinary range of debates between astroturf groups versus grassroots movements around the country. It's very clear by now that the Tea Party represents pretty much the people who are paying for it, which are the Koch brothers and their associates that support the 1%, the bankers who want deregulation of everything, including all of the tar sands extraction. They don't want any effective control over that. They don't want any effective control over mountaintop removal, so they're supporting the mountaintop removal. They're supporting fracking in the Marcellus Shale throughout New York and Pennsylvania and the Delaware River Basin. And basically they're supporting all attempts to defend the Reagan deregulation dream. This was their dream of the American way, defending, as they call it in their meeting last week, defending the American dream. They had a summit for it in Washington, D.C. Well, this is a very stark contrast to the real grassroots movements, which are being represented by the Coffee Party, that support the 99%, that oppose further carbon addiction of the American economy, get the economy off of carbon. Here's where the true job builders are, not in the extraction industry, which has a very few jobs and a lot of machinery and a lot of use of fossil fuels, but getting away from this defending the past dream that was good for the deregulated industries and made them the richest in all of human history. But they're opposing for the carbon addiction. They're supporting instead the post-carbon energy system based on new kinds of technologies that don't depend on burning carbon. And they are supporting grassroots struggles for rebuilding the American dream, not defending the American dream of deregulation, which got the 1% quite rich, but rebuilding the American dream around new aspirations altogether. So we've seen these contests pretty clearly and very decisively in the last several months, and it came to a crescendo this last week. It's good to catch up, in effect, on what happened in this rebuild movement, because it's not defending, it's rebuilding is the logic here. A very different kind of approach, and you can tell the difference between the Tea Party and the Coffee Party, between the AstroTurf people who are trying to defend the billions of dollars they've made off of the American public, and the people who want to rebuild the dream and just change the nature of the dialogue here. Well, let's take a look at what happened a week ago. This is pretty amazing. Bill McKibben had over 10,000 people surrounding the White House a week ago today. And he was interviewed about it the day after by Amy Goodman. Take a look. It's pretty amazing. We'll jump right in after the music here if we can, and you'll see.
DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Over 10,000 protesters surrounded the White House Sunday, calling on President Obama to reject the proposed Keystone XL tar sands oil pipeline from Canada to the Gulf Coast. The protest came exactly a year before the 2012 election, and the pipeline is shaping up to be a major political issue. The Los Angeles Times reported today the Obama administration is considering a move that could delay a decision on the pipeline until after the election. The administration may require sponsors to reduce the project's environmental risks before it can be approved.
Last week, President Obama said for the first time he'll make the final decision on whether to approve TransCanada's controversial Keystone XL tar sands oil pipeline from Alberta, Canada to refineries in Texas. Up until then, Obama said the final decision rested with the State Department. Obama made the comment in an interview with a local TV station in Nebraska where there has been fierce opposition to the pipeline.
The State Department's in charge of analyzing this because there's a pipeline coming in from Canada. They'll be giving me a report over the next several months. And my general attitude is what is best for the American people, what's best for our economy, both short-term and long-term, but also what's best for the health of the American people, because we don't want, for example, aquifers that are adversely affected. Folks in Nebraska obviously would be directly impacted. And so we want to make sure that we're taking the long view on these issues.
To talk more about the Keystone XL pipeline, we go to Washington, D.C. to speak with Bill McKibben, one of the key organizers of yesterday's protest, founder of 360.org. Bill, welcome to Democracy Now! Tell us what happened and why you are protesting. 350.org, let me correct myself.
Amy, yesterday was a gorgeous day in Washington. It was a gorgeous day in the weather, but it was even more beautiful, the sort of spirit outside the White House. We thought maybe we could get enough people to ring the White House, something that hadn't been done apparently since the 1960s, according to some of the veteran activists on hand. But we were a little worried that there'd be enough, because even 3 months ago, no one in this country really knew very much about this pipeline except in Nebraska. As it turns out, people poured in from across the eastern seaboard and as far west as Chicago. We surrounded the White House 3, 4, and 5 deep. It was a beautiful, beautiful sight. And it really underlined that this has become not only the biggest environmental flashpoint in many, many years, but maybe the issue in recent times in the Obama administration when he's been most directly confronted by people in the street. in this case, people willing, hopeful, almost dying for him to be the Barack Obama of 2008. Every banner that people carried yesterday had quotes from that wonderful rhetoric of that election. Time to end the tyranny of oil. In my administration, the rise of the oceans will begin to slow. We're looking for some kind of glimmer, some kind of echo of that Barack Obama to reemerge and do the right thing on this pipeline.
Well, Bill, the administration has already taken about 3 years, and now there's this report in the LA Times that it may postpone a decision for another year. Your sense of, clearly this is the impact of this movement, but do you consider, if they do decide to postpone this, a victory of sorts?
So the best case is Barack Obama says, you know what? This thing's a bad idea. My foremost climatologist, Jim Hansen at NASA, says that if we tap the tar sands heavily, it's game over for the climate. That should be enough. But if he also says, or instead says, it's very clear that this process has been completely flawed and that the environmental review that the State Department conducted was a joke, and so we're sending it back to square one for a fresh, independent review, well, I think there's no way this pipeline proposal would ever survive that.
Well, that's the question, I guess, and that's what's next. They're going to, in fact, be taken to a new review because of the occupation of over 10,000 people in Washington last Sunday. The administration has decided to review the issue. And sure enough, Naomi Klein came on the next day, in effect, or on the 11th, and pointed this out. You can check it out. It's clearly on the web. She points out that basically there was an environmental victory. Obama delays the Keystone XL oil pipeline decision until after the election, 2013. Well, in effect, there'll be no action on that front, but it doesn't mean a victory. And on places like this, it may mean a further step backwards.
After the Obama administration put off approving the tar sands oil pipeline, another major fight between environmentalists and the White House is brewing in the Northeast. Earlier this week, the Delaware River Basin Commission released draft regulations to allow for the natural gas drilling technique known as fracking in the river's watershed. The commission's expected to vote on the rules on November 21st. With one seat on the commission, the White House may cast the deciding vote. The states of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware also each have a representative on the board. In a moment, we'll be joined by the film director and activist Josh Fox, who made the Academy Award-nominated film Gasland. But first, let's turn to his new short web video about this upcoming vote.
The Delaware River has never been in greater danger. There's never been a more decisive or important moment in the fight against fracking in the Delaware River Basin than right now. Gas drilling companies have leased over 200,000 acres that border the Delaware River and its tributaries. For the past 3.5 years, thousands upon thousands of citizens and scores of organizations have fought to keep gas drilling out of the Delaware River Basin. And for the past 3.5 years, the region has been in moratorium. On November 21st, all that could change.
All in favor?
Aye. On November 21st, the Delaware River Basin Commission will decide whether or not to end that moratorium and pass a plan that would allow for 20,000 gas wells in the Delaware River Basin. The Upper Delaware is one of the Northeast's most important watershed areas, providing clean water to Trenton, Philadelphia, southern New Jersey, and it is part of the interconnected watershed system that provides water to New York City, altogether providing water to 15 million people. Gas drilling and hydraulic fracturing is an inherently contaminating industrial process that injects millions of gallons of water laced with toxic chemicals at enormous pressure to break apart rock and release gas from underground formations. Watersheds across the nation have been contaminated with plastics, carcinogens, neurotoxins, and endocrine-disrupting chemicals, and with explosive natural gas. It causes massive land scarring, air pollution, a public health crisis, massive truck traffic, miles and miles of pipelines, blowouts, spills, accidents. It is a whole-scale industrialization. Now we face our most urgent crisis to date.
A new short-web video made by Josh Fox, director of the Academy Award-nominated film Gasland. Josh Fox was also arrested, along with his mother, among the more than 1,200 people who are protesting the Keystone XL pipeline in Washington, D.C.
Okay, now, definitely should look at the complete video with him, Josh Fox, but also check out this whole question. Basically, tar sands, mountaintop removal, which we'll look at in detail in future programs, fracking, all of these are carbon extraction efforts. And the grassroots struggles that are emerging in the country and around the world are basically saying, keep the carbon in the ground. Don't use it. Get off it. You're addicted to it, but you have to move to a post-carbon economy. Climate change, which it's evoking, whether it's through fracking or the tar sands or the mountaintop removal, if you oxidize that carbon, you're going to create a climate nothing can live in. No civilizations will persist. So while the target in many cases might have started out being something like the tar sands, it very quickly has now been shown to be linked to the other extractive industries, which are the mountaintop removal and the fracking, and the total combined assault that they all represent on the climate. This is why the Nation magazine, coming up later this month, it's going to be dated the 28th, it actually came out on the 9th, has the cover story and quite a long article by Naomi Klein on capitalism versus the climate. Keep in touch with us on this, because we're going to be covering all three aspects of this. That is, the tar sands, the mountaintop removal, and the fracking, and how all of it illustrates the enormous swell of grassroots struggles in this country to resist the suicidal use of carbon in our economy. We've got to move beyond carbon. The public understands this now. The politicians who are being financed by the 1% don't understand it. But the 99% does. So keep in touch as we keep in touch on these issues, and look to a solution that is survivable, not only for our country, but for the whole world.